Okay, so we're going to get started today doing a little bit more advanced Photoshop than we did last class. It builds a little bit on the same theories. We'll actually do some of the same stuff but incorporate a little bit that's different. And what we're going to talk about today is something called blending modes that are available in Photoshop. And I would argue that this is one of the more powerful tools that's built into Photoshop that's also one of the least used tools. And so whenever you encounter or you watch a tutorial online of somebody who's really good in Photoshop, they have a good mastery of these blending modes. And so I introduce it really early to you, even though we won't use it too much until the end of the semester. We will use it extensively toward the end of the semester, and I'll give you a little carrot today of why it's really valuable to design students or architecture students in general. But blending modes are something that you just kind of have to try out to start to understand what's happening. But I'll do my best to explain it in lecture format first, and then we'll go through. I have a sample file that you're going to download today that has the images that I show in lecture. We'll work through the samples, and then I'll start to let you guys explore a little bit more on your own. So fundamentally, what a blending mode does is it's kind of like using a stack of tracing paper. And so if you imagine, for example, that you have a drawing, and you've drawn for a while on that piece of paper, and then you lay a piece of white trace over that drawing, and you draw some more on it. The white trace and the drawing that you do on that white trace changes the look of the drawing as you look down on it, correct? Yeah. Okay, now imagine instead of using white trace, you used yellow trace. Would that change how the drawing looked? Yeah, it would. So depending on what color trace you use or what method you use to apply a layer above onto a layer below, you're going to get a slightly different look. So what Photoshop does is it treats this very similar to the analog method where we put these sheets of trace on. It's similar to the opacity slider in that you make something a little bit more transparent. You see more of what's underneath. But the difference here is how it applies the transparency. And that's the difficult part to understand. So I'm going to go through and show you some examples so that it starts to make a little bit more sense. The blending modes that are available in Photoshop are divided into groups. We have our normal blending modes, which almost always you're going to see normal listed. That's the default. Then we get into some blending modes right here that generally darken the image. There's a little divider line, and then we get into blending modes that generally lighten the image. And then the image here uses contrast, but essentially this is darkening the darks and lightening the lights for the most part. So we're affecting both the darks and the lights parts of the image. And then these are some specialty ones down at the bottom that we don't use very frequently. The truth is that there are three that are the big ones. The first one that generally darkens an image, and these are the ones we'll use today, is called multiply. Right there, we'll use that one extensively. Obviously, you use normal. Normal is the basic one. We'll use we'll use multiply to generally darken an image. We'll use screen, which is available right there, to generally lighten an image. And we'll use overlay to darken the darks and lighten the lights. We will later on in the semester use the soft light, but that's a little bit more specific in terms of what you're trying to do. So I'm not worried about soft light today, but I at least wanted to point that out. Generally speaking, we're in this multiply, screen, and overlay are our three big ones. And that's what we'll play around with today. So let me show you some actual examples. In setting this up, however, I need you to understand what you're looking at. So this is the best way that I could come up with in lecture format to try to describe that. But essentially, we have two layers. We have a layer that's just blue. That's the bottom layer. That's the one that's first on the desk if you were doing it in the analog fashion. It's just blue. Then we have another layer that's on top of that layer that has a gradient across the bottom, and it has a black square, a 50% neutral gray square in the middle, and a white square. So those three squares plus the gradient are on a layer that is on top of the blue layer. That's what we're seeing here. So two layers, one's on top, one's below. We are going to be applying the blending mode to the top layer. So it's changing the top layer as if you switch from white trace to yellow trace. It's going to change what happens with that top layer. So here it is. No blending modes have been applied to any layer yet. What we're going to do first is we're going to apply a multiply blending mode.
So again, I'll do all of this live for you. This here is the layers panel that we've seen before in Photoshop. And the active layer right there is selected in that lightish blue color. That's layer 1. And the blending mode is going to be changed to multiply, which is a little drop down that's right there. And when that happens, the areas that are lighter on the multiply layer, so the layer, the parts of the image that's on top that are lighter than what is below, in this case the white is a good example, are going to become transparent or semi-transparent. So in the case of this, the white is lighter than the blue, so it's going to become transparent. The gray is somewhat lighter than the blue, so it's going to become semi-transparent. The black, however, is darker than the blue, so it's going to become a dark blue. So let's go ahead and see that when it happens. So we apply the blending mode, the white goes away, the gray is semi-transparent, and the black becomes really dark. I'll do it one more time. I'll back up so you can see it happen one more time. So as that happens, the light goes away. So that's in the multiply blending mode. If, however, we switch to the screen blending mode, so we're in screen mode, same thing. There's our active layer. That's the one that's on top. We're going to switch right here to screen. And when we do that, it's going to be the opposite effect. The darker section, so the black, is going to become transparent or semi-transparent. The lightest pieces, the white, is going to remain opaque. So it's the exact opposite of what happened in the multiply. So as you watch this happen, the black goes away, the white stays strong. So in my case, in my example here, I apologize, my black wasn't true black, it was a really, really dark gray, which is why it didn't go away completely. So I'll repeat that one more time. This is in the screen blending mode. So same image, same thing applied. When we switch to, sorry, this is in multiply, I went back too many slides, hold on. There we go. We're in the screen blending mode here. The dark areas are going to become transparent or semi-transparent. The lighter areas get lighter. And there it is when it happens. Finally, the last one that we'll play around with is the overlay blending mode. So same thing here. The difference is the middle is going to stay opaque, and the lighter is going to get the middle is going to become transparent. The white is going to become white. The black is going to become black. So essentially, it's the same thing, but we're doing both at the same time. So let me show you live. This is an easier one to see when it happens. So the dark becomes darker, the light becomes lighter, and the middle becomes transparent. So here we are one more time. Dark becomes darker, middle becomes transparent, light becomes lighter. So what I want you to do now, and that's it for my actual slides, is we have to actually do this in demonstration purposes. So I'm going to switch over to the school computer, but I want you all to log into the digital tools site and go to today's exercise 105, because there's a file, a Photoshop file that you're going to download that we're all going to do together. So hang on a second while I switch over and download that file in the meantime. Okay. So we've switched over to the school computer. I'm logged in to the course website here. I've gone to exercise 105, which is today's exercise. So I went to exercises. I went to fall of 2018. And then I went ahead and clicked on exercise 105, which is today's exercise. As I scroll down here under part 1, there's download sample file ps-blendingmodes.psd. That's the one I want you to download. So I'll click on it, and it'll start downloading here. Perfect. When it's done, I'll go ahead and open that one up. And you should see something very similar to what I just showed you in the demonstration of the lecture. And you can actually see now that you've downloaded it on your own computer that the black is dark gray. It's not really black. That was my mistake. Yeah. You can't log into your account? Weird. OK, hold on a second. Let me come around.
Okay, so that appears to be fixed. I apologize for that. Once you download it, you should see this same file that I showed you in lecture format here. And you can also see, like I said, that the black isn't really black. That's my mistake when I created this sample file. So a couple things I want to point out. First off, in our layers on the right side over here, there are actually 4 layers. The first one is the background layer. Then we have layer 1, 2, and 3. Layer 2 and 3 should be turned off. We're going to use those in a little bit. And I'll do another demonstration with layers 2 and 3. We're only working with layer 1 and the background layer. This is a good place to point out that the background layer, which is that blue color, is italicized and it has a little lock icon next to it. That means we can't actually modify that background layer. It's fixed and locked. We'll get to the place where we tend to unlock the background layer, but for right now it's just coming as a default layer, and that's fine. Layer 1, if I were to turn off the background layer, we could see that layer 1 is in fact just these 3 squares plus the gradient at the bottom. It works independently of the background layer. So if I click the little eye icon next to them, we can see that the background layer is just blue, and that this layer here, layer 1, has those 3 squares plus the gradient on it. To switch the blending mode of a layer, we would select layer 1. So there's the layer that we want to change the blending mode on. And right up above the layer stack here, you'll see a drop-down menu that's called Normal. This Normal is your blending mode. When we click on it, there's the list of blending modes that I showed you earlier. Looks very similar. They may have changed something in CC versus CS6, which was what my slide was from. But essentially, we're getting the same thing. The first one that we're going to try out is one called Multiply. And so if I click on Multiply as my blending mode, we're going to see what happened in lecture happen again here. So what is white becomes completely transparent. What is gray becomes semi-transparent. And what is black becomes darker. So it's not actually leaving the black. It's actually a very, very dark blue right now because it's not truly black. But you guys can see that happen. The gradient at the bottom shows you how this happens. So true white is completely transparent, and the darker we get in gray, the darker the blue becomes. And that's what I mean by semi-transparent. If instead of the multiply blending mode, we switch down here to the screen blending mode, the opposite is going to happen, where the black area becomes transparent, and the further toward white we become, the more solid it becomes. And ultimately, on the right side at true white, it's true white. So the two work opposite each other. Remember, this group up here that has multiply in it generally darkens an image. This group down here generally lightens an image. And we're using screen. There are other options that are built in. Like I said, we're picking on the most common ones. So we did multiply and we did screen. But you can also see that there are other examples in here. So for example, lighten. This just has to do with mathematically how the blending mode is applied. So I can do lighten, and we get a little bit different results. Likewise, I could do darken, and we get a little bit different results in darken. So the most common ones are multiply and screen, but that doesn't mean those are the only ones you can use. There are also ones hidden in here that really do some strange stuff. Like color dodge can be a little bizarre, and it can actually alter colors. But it is something that is available under these menus. The last one is overlay. And overlay is kind of like doing the multiply and the screen at the same time, where the middle becomes the transparent one, and the darks become darker, and the lights become lighter. So I've been showing you this stuff, and you guys are all sitting there saying, why on earth would this be important? And I get that. That's OK. But I promise you it is important. And I'm going to show you an example of where it becomes important. So I want you to turn off layer 1 for a second, and I want you to turn on layer 2. And when I turn on layer 2, I have a little drawing that was done in SketchUp that has some black lines on a white background. And my guess is that in 120 or one of your early classes, you tried to do a little bit of work in SketchUp. You got an output from SketchUp, and you realized that the JPEG that came out was a white background with black lines. and maybe you wanted it to go in your portfolio, maybe you wanted to be able to change the background color, maybe you wanted to put sky in the background or something like that, and you went in and you tried to erase the white. Okay, well, I can do that. I could, on this layer, I could come over and I could use my color selection tool, or I could use a background eraser tool, or I could even just use a regular eraser tool, and I could erase, I could erase the background and get the blue to show through. The truth, though, is that that's way too much work to go through and isolate the object in that manner. Instead, I could use something like a blending mode to make the white go away. So remember, on that first one that I used, the multiply, it made the white transparent. So all I have to do on this layer 2 is switch from normal mode into multiply mode, and I'm going to get a line drawing on whatever my background is. And it doesn't have to be this blue background. It could be clouds. It could be anything. The point is that I can very easily get rid of white. I can make the white transparent without actually having to erase it, just by changing the blending mode. So likewise, let me go ahead and switch that back to normal for a second. If I turn on layer 3, this is the inverse, where I have white lines on a black background. If I took this one, and instead of using my multiply, which wouldn't get very far, I could switch and use screen, and I'd get the white lines on a blue background, because I made the black become transparent. So these techniques are something that we'll use extensively when we start working in SketchUp later on in the semester, to take our outputs and be able to work with them as line drawings, rather than having to actually isolate the lines themselves. So it is something that's very useful as you get used to the concept of it. But it's not limited to just architectural things. And that's where we're going to explore a little bit more today in the world of photography. We were talking about digital photographs and stuff last class. We will do the same thing today using blending modes. We'll enhance some digital photos. So I mentioned to you guys that you could, if you had an old faded picture, you could bring it in today and use that as an example. If you don't, we're going to have to find an old faded picture. I'm going to encourage you today to do a Creative Commons image search rather than just a Google image search. You can technically do this via Google Images, but setting your options is a little bit more tricky in Google Images. The idea behind Creative Commons is that artists and people who take photographs and publish their content online can grant you, as a student, rights to use their work. And what Creative Commons is it's the system, the legal system by which they can grant you rights to use their work. Generally speaking, the only thing you have to do if you borrow their image is say, hey, I borrowed this image from so-and-so, which is why I suggest in the handout for today that you guys go ahead and put a link to where you got the image. That essentially says, hey, thanks a lot for letting me borrow your image. You can find these by doing the Creative Commons search. That's the easiest way of finding all images that are Creative Commons. If you go to search.creativecommons.org, it will take you to the Creative Commons search engine. And here you could type what you are searching for. So I might say old photograph, for example. And we have a variety of sources that you can search. We could search Google Images if we wanted to by clicking on the Google Images. Let me go back. We could also search Flickr, which is another great source for images. Either one tends to work out pretty well. Some of these other ones are not as useful for photographs, for example. But if I went to the Google Images here for old photograph, there I'd see a bunch of old photographs that I can work with. In Google Images, just so you know, it's always a good idea to look for images of a specific size. Google Images loves to return very small images. So if you're using Google Images, I would go and enable your tools. And I would go to size and make sure you go to larger than. And for the case of what we're doing, you're looking at 2 or 4 megapixels in size. We want bigger images. These other ones aren't going to do much for you. So I would say at least 2 megapixels, maybe 4 megapixels. We'll see what the end results are. And what we're looking for is we're looking for an image that's kind of faded out, that's not going to give us too much. You know, maybe something like that would be a good image to work with, if it actually sharpened up a little bit. And one of the things you'll find when I'm doing these demonstrations is I don't tend to pick images ahead of time because I want you to see that I have to search for them too. So if you're looking for an image, it may take a little while. We're looking for images that aren't well done. So a lot of these images are already turning out really nice. We're looking for something that's older and more faded that we can actually make a result from. You may find that instead of just old photograph, you might put in faded. And see if we get better results. So something like this one, for example, is rather faded. That might work nicely. Well, I'm failing at finding one that I like, so I'm going to go ahead and open one from last semester. But you guys can keep looking for them to find one. I'm going to go ahead and open up one from last semester. I'm going to go to my flash drive here. Oops, sorry, wrong class. All right, and I've got several different examples. I'll use this one as an example. So this is an old photograph here of Lake Tahoe. They're saying it's the entrance to Emerald Bay, which is incorrect, but that's OK. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead and try to work to enhance this image a little bit using the blending mode techniques that we already talked about. So a couple things. One, if you pull up your handout, we're going to give you a little bit more information. I've moved on to part 2 in your handout for today. And I'm going to start by doing a levels adjustment. So that's what we did last class. I'm encouraging you to do this anyway because you need to get in the habit of practicing doing this. So the first thing that I'll do is a levels adjustment. And I did that by going to my layer. I went to New Adjustment Layer, and I went to Levels. And I went and we can call this Levels. And I say, OK, there it is. And I made sure that black is black and white is white. So I'm going to pull this over to darken and pull this over a little bit. So that by itself has helped the image a great deal. So there it was before. There it is now. So I've already enhanced the mountainside quite a bit by just doing the levels adjustment. So that's a good thing. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a multiply blending mode to this adjustment layer and see what happens. So let me go ahead and turn on this, and I'll switch my blending mode here from normal to multiply. And you can see when I do that, suddenly the clouds become very, very visible here. Unfortunately, because it's darkening the darks, it also made all of the trees and stuff too dark, which is less than desirable. But it certainly helped for the clouds. And so we can toggle that on and off. In this view, you can hardly even see the clouds. But in that view, you can really start to see those clouds. And it's working rather nicely. So that first one was a multiply blending mode. Okay? If the blending mode is a little bit too strong, you can also adjust the opacity value, which is right here. The opacity right now is at 100%. We could drop this down, and less of it will apply. So it's still helping the image, but it's not quite as strong. So there it is at 100%. I'm going to leave it like that. I'm also going to rename this to levels, and I'll say /multiply. You could do these as one layer and just change it each time, but since I'm trying to show you what I'm doing, I think it's helpful to do it as separate little layers. So let me go ahead and turn off the multiply, and I'll do this again using screen to see what happens. So I'll go ahead and do my levels adjustment once again. So I'll go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to choose Levels. And I'll call this Levels/Screen. And I'll say OK. And I'll go ahead and pinch the black point over and the white point over, just as I've been doing each time I do a levels adjustment. There it is. And now this time, instead of having a multiply applied to my adjustment, I'm going to do a screen. So I'll change from normal here to screen. And there it is. So in this example, we have a lot of the shadow detail. If I were to zoom in here a little bit, a lot of the detail that's in the shadows in the trees has come back as part of this. So that's a really nice effect for that. There it is. We're brightening it up. When I look at the sky, however, I've lost almost all the sky and all the background. So you can see where I'm going with this, right? You can see that I'm ultimately going to end up with a multiply or with a overlay blending mode. So there's my screen. I'll do this one more time, and I'll go into my layer, new adjustment layer, and this time it's going to be levels. And this is going to be levels with a overlay. I'll go ahead and say OK. There's my overlay. Levels with the overlay. I need to change first the black point and the white point. There we go. And then I'm going to change the blending mode on this, not to be multiply, not to be screen, but to be overlay. And in that scenario, it's supposed to do both for me, but it did a terrible job at doing it. It's darkening the darks and lightening the lights. So I actually kind of want the inverse of that. You got to love it when you do something live and it doesn't do what you want it to do. No, we'll go with it for right now. I think what I'll do is I'll apply this one at a lesser opacity. So I get, ultimately we're going to use masking to correct some of that. So anyway, I have the overlay, I have the screen, and I have the multiply. I'm asking you in part 2, part 3, and part 4 to post 2 images for each one, the original and the edited version. In your purposes, if you use the same image like I just did, it's 1 original and 3 of the processed images. So 1 original and then a multiply, a screen, and an overlay. So in that case, it would be 4 instead of 6 images. If you want to do it to different images, that's OK too, as you start to play around with this. The next one that we'll go through is a luminosity adjustment. And I'll do that in just a second. But I'll do that not with a black and white photo. I'm going to do that with a color photo because we're going to get a lot more out of it. So in that case, I'm going to try one other thing just as illustration purposes. I'm going to go back to my background layer. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on my background layer and say Duplicate Layer. And this is going to give me a second copy. This is another strategy for applying blending modes that can be effective sometimes. I have a copy of the original, and I'm going to apply the blending mode on the copy. So I'll switch here into my overlay, and it does a little bit better job than the levels overlay. I could also switch into a multiply, or I could switch into a screen, and it does a little bit different job as I'm going through this. So let me go back to multiply, for example, and let's turn this down. So it's just a different strategy for doing this kind of post-processing, but certainly available just like the levels adjustments are. So I'll let you guys play around with that. We're going to move on to luminosity. I'm going to go ahead and open up a new file for that. This works particularly well in a sunset. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a sunset image here. And when I do the luminosity adjustment, I'm going to do the luminosity on a curve. So we're going to follow Photoshop 1.3, which is the curves tutorial. And I'll do that by going to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. And so we'll call this Curves Luminosity. I'll go ahead and say OK. There it is. There's my curve. What I need to create here is the traditional S curve that I talked about last class. So I'll peg the center point on this graph right there in the center. And I'm going to take this lower quadrant and slightly lower the values. And I'll take this upper quadrant and slightly raise the values. So this very loosely resembles an S. And we can already see that that did enhance the colors a bit from where it was. So there I was originally. There's the enhanced colors, a little bit more saturation. That might be a little bit too much, which is where the luminosity comes into play here. So I'm going to go ahead and select that curves luminosity layer, and I'll change the blending mode to luminosity, which is right down here at the bottom. And there we go. It's probably the kind of thing where it's hard for you to see it on the projector as much as I can see it on the screen, but it does pull out the shadows just a little bit and give you good saturation. So it can be great for a sunset type scene or anything with lots of reds and blues in it. So when you pick your image to do this, if you don't have one of your own that is a sunset, you can certainly do it using an example from online. Just pick one with a lot of reds or blues in it. I'm going to do it one more time using a different image just so you can see it. There's another image right here of a sunset. I'll do the same luminosity. I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. And I'll go ahead and say OK. I'm going to peg my center. I'll slightly lower this part of the curve. I'll slightly raise the lighter part of the curve, like that. There's my S curve. And I'll take this curves layer and apply a luminosity adjustment to it. There it is. So in this example, it's a little bit less noticeable, I think, than this example, toggling between them. But that's part of why I'm doing it multiple times, so that you can see this, this happen. So we've done the luminosity, which was part 5. You'll have 2 images for that. You'll have your original image, and you'll have your processed image. Flip it over, and we're going to move into part 6, which is using screen or any of the other blending modes to add some texture to the background. And so you will find over the course of this semester that I speak frequently about adding grunge or adding dirt to a particular image. And the reason that I'm suggesting that you do this or asking you to do it or experiment with doing it, especially when we start doing collages, is that computers are inherently very, very clean. Whenever you render something, whenever you model something, whenever you process something, it's always very sharp and clean. The real world is not sharp and clean. It never is. I mean, I guess in rare circumstances when something's brand new and freshly painted, it's sharp and clean. But most of the time, the real world has some dirt. And so I think the best example of this is you guys have probably seen Toy Story, right? Okay, Pixar had a group of the artists whose sole responsibility in the whole movie was to add dirt. Because if they didn't add the dirt, things would look less realistic. So the dirt is really, really important in these sorts of environments. So this is a very early stage, but adding a little bit of texture or a little bit of dirt can be very valuable. So we're going to use this same blending mode to do this dirt or add a paper texture or whatever. When you're searching for this kind of a background image, you want to look for something called a grunge texture. And once again, I already have this set up that's labeled for reuse and that's larger than 4 megapixels. So I'm just going to go ahead and change my search term. But you could also go back to the Creative Commons search, which is right here. And you would be searching for grunge texture. There we go. And these are examples of grunge textures. They usually have some form of dirt to them. Sometimes they're more of a crinkle paper, which can be useful. Sometimes they're concrete walls, etc. Sometimes peeling paint. You could scroll through. I have a whole file in my resources folder on my flash drive of grunge textures that I've had and used, some of which are really good, and I really like to use them. For your purposes today, I'm going to go ahead and download. I'll do this one because it'll be a pretty obvious example. Let's go ahead and visit the page. Maybe. Come on. There we go. Save the image as, and I'm going to put it into my flash drive. And like I said, I have a resources folder, and inside of my resources folder, I have a folder for grunge textures, and I've got a bunch of grunge textures that I've done over time. I'll go ahead and click on Save, and we'll save that image. There it is. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring that image in to this file. And I'll do that by going up to the File menu and choosing Place. We have a couple different places that are available. We have a place linked and a place embed. The idea behind a place linked is that it doesn't actually embed the original file into your Photoshop file, thereby keeping the Photoshop file a little bit smaller. In Photoshop, however, I would always encourage you to just go ahead and place embedded because unlike InDesign, where you'll want linked references, keeping track of linked references in a Photoshop file is a bit challenging. So I would go ahead and just place embedded.
and I want to go find that file that I just downloaded. So it was in my resources folder, into my Grunge Textures, and there it was, the crumpled paper. I'll go ahead and click on Place, and it was a really small image. Is it going to be that blurry? Okay, let me see if it sharpens up. Yeah, it's too blurry. Let me do this one again. Sorry. I'll use one that I've already downloaded. So I'll go to Place Embed, and here's a paper, wrinkle paper that I know is actually big enough. There we go. It came in a little bit small still, so I'm going to enlarge it. When I enlarge it, I'm holding down the Shift key on the keyboard to keep it in proportion, though it doesn't really matter for this kind of a texture if it's stretched a little bit. If I let go of the Shift key, you can see that I can stretch it. If I hold down the Shift key, it's going to stay in proportion, like this, and I'll move it down like that. When I'm done at the top here, I'll go ahead and click this little check mark to say, yes, I've brought it in and I've sized it correctly. Now here's where we're going to use the blending modes to make this transparent. So rather than, a lot of people do this first, they go to the opacity and they say, well, let me just make it a little transparent, and that's good enough. It's not as good of an effect, however, so let's try using a blending mode. We'll go through each one. We'll try multiply first. Yeah, that's darkening it a bit too much. We'll try overlay. No, that's not quite right. And we'll try screen. Okay? Screen's pretty good because it's giving us a lot of the texture. The problem is it's too strong. We're not seeing enough of the image itself. That's where changing the opacity can be valuable. So we'll now drop the opacity down, and there'll be a happy medium point. Maybe we'll go back to multiply for a second and see. I'm trying to get one that you guys can see on the screen a little bit better. Yeah, something like that, where it looks like it's a crumpled piece of paper, for example. And so maybe I end up doing this and I don't like it that much, and maybe I'd rather go in and go to, let me go Place, Embedded, and let me pick a different texture, maybe this one. There we go. Let me rotate this. Again, I'm holding down Shift, and then make this one a little bit bigger. Make that one a little bit bigger, so it's darkening the edges. It has a few little ink spots here, and we'll go through and we'll try, I can commit to it, and we'll try the various blending modes. We'll go to multiply first. Okay, that one's not bad. It's a little bit strong. I could adjust the opacity down, and that one might be pretty good with a little bit of an ink stain that's on it. The point is that it's an easy way of adding this kind of texture, this kind of grunge, this kind of dirt. We could also go through the other options. We could go to screen and see if we liked it that way. Looks a little bit more faded. We could go into overlay mode and see. Actually, in this case, the overlay mode looks pretty good. So keep playing around with it. You can try different grunge textures. Again, that's Place Embedded, and you'll pick your grunge texture and apply it. You could apply other kinds of textures. If you wanted clouds in the sky, for example, you could apply clouds behind. We will talk about masking soon, in which case you'll have a lot more control over where certain blending modes are applied. When we get to posting our work, we're going to do the same strategy as last class, where you're going to do a gallery and you're going to post a bunch of images. Remember, for parts 1, 2, and 2, 3, 4, you're going to have probably one image plus original plus 3 of the modified version, so that would be 4 total images. Luminosity would be 2, that would be 5, 6. Screen would be 2, 7, 8. So I'm looking for 8 to 10 images today as part of your post. You'll notice also that this is not the kind of exercise that's going to cause you to take all of your time today in class. There's a reason that I gave you a little bit of extra time, and that is because you have an assignment due next Monday. So now's your opportunity, 17th, right? Which is Monday. Yeah. So your assignment's due next Monday before I start talking, remember? So you should take your extra time and go ahead and start processing your image and start thinking about how to make your image the best image it can possibly be. Remember to think a lot about composition. That's a big one. Bad composition, no matter how much post-processing you do, won't end up being a good image. Good composition, good post-processing. Just because I showed you all of these techniques doesn't mean it's valid or valuable to do all of these.
You can pick and choose which ones are the most appropriate to make your image the absolute best image it can be. When you make your post for that assignment, sometime between now and when I start talking next Monday, remember it's the original image, it's the final image, and it's what you did. A little paragraph that describes what your post-processing was. Are there any questions about that? No? Okay, good. You do have the remainder of the time to do this part of the exercise and work on your assignment, which is my goal, to give you that extra time. If you have any questions, please let me know.